This evening, I'm going to start off reading from Mark chapter 12. This isn't in your outline. I'm going to read from Mark chapter 12, and I'm going to read just from, let me read verse 30, and then I'll also go down and read verse 33. I'm going to start there. It's not going to be the verse that I use now as we talk about the heart, but the reason I'm going to use these two verses is because often when people do talk about the heart, these are the two verses they go to. And in such doing, they sometimes cause some confusion. I say that because I myself have often gone to this verse and I think done more harm in explaining than I've done good. So let's look at Mark 12. Notice verse 30, and then I'll skip down to verse 33. And thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy mind, and with all thy strength. This is the first commandment. Now if you skip down to verse 33, we then have recorded, and to love him with all the heart, and with all the understanding, and with all the soul, and with all the strength, and to love his neighbor as himself is more than all whole burnt offerings and sacrifices. Well, I'm not going to use those passages as we talk about the heart. I think understanding the heart as it is described in the Bible has caused many people confusion, and so I'm going to try to approach it in a very different way. The heart is a very interesting thing, not only the physical heart, but the spiritual heart. I did some looking this week at statistics on the heart. About 610,000 people die of heart disease every year in our United States. But as I began to think about that, that's just talking about physical death because of the heart. We understand that many people are dying spiritually because of spiritual heart disease. Now, as you begin to talk about the spiritual heart, for many, it brings up a topic in which they do not understand. And I think because of that, it is one of the primary reasons for lack of unity found in the religious world today, specifically those who would claim to be Christians. Now, we know that great progress has been made in the studying of the physical heart, and yet I want you to understand this, that we can't have a good understanding about the Bible heart. Now, as I try to compare the two and we give some understanding to the spiritual heart, we know that it is very similar in design to the physical heart. We know that all the chambers have a distinct function. We know that each of them has to be kept in proper working order. For a lot of us as husbands, that's why our wives make us eat the things that we eat. They're trying to keep us healthy. Well, just as we try to keep our physical heart healthy, we understand we have to keep our spiritual heart healthy. The physical heart has 4 different chambers. Now, specifically, the upper 2 are called the atria, the lower 2 are called ventricles. Well, I try to think of the spiritual heart in the same way. We have 4 chambers. They can be thought of in this manner, and I'm going to break them down, because in such doing, we're going to understand what the spiritual heart is actually made of and what it does. The very first heart I'm going to call the digestive chamber. The second one is the combustion chamber. The third chamber will be the judicial chamber. The fourth is going to be the executive chamber. Now, those are the 4 chambers we're going to give to the spiritual heart tonight as we break down the functions of the spiritual heart. But we understand that these chambers direct all of man's thoughts and all of their emotions. We're going to look at some verses as we begin to go through these 4 different spiritual chambers of the spiritual heart. All right, let's look first at the digestive chamber of the spiritual heart. I don't think this one's going to be a hard one for us to grasp. Most of us understand that the spiritual heart does have intellect. What I mean by that is this chamber, this intellect chamber, it allows us to do a couple of different activities. One, it allows us to know things. It allows us to think about things, to use our cognitive processes, and it also allows us to understand things. Okay? And so in this very first section of the spiritual heart that we're looking at, we're going to talk about the intellect. Now, we know that man has intellect. We know that man can know things. For example, I can know that 2 + 2 = 4, right? That's not to be disputed. We understand that man has the ability to reason and to understand. And so 2 + 2 = 4, and I know that because I learned it. I learned it, one, by memory, but I also learned it as a child the same way that you all learned. in which your parents would lay out 4 things and you would count, and they would work through how if you pull 2 on one side and 2 on the other, you still have 4 things. And so as humans, we have this ability to learn and to understand. We know that 2 plus 2 is 4. We also learn things like being able to change a tire. For most of us, that's not something that we just walked up to a car and immediately looked at and understood. Again, somebody had to show it to us. And yet, with our intellect, we understood it. It's the same thing when we began to talk about knowing Bible truth. Oftentimes, somebody will show us the verses, we'll look at it, we'll read it, we'll know it because we've thought about it, we understand it. Okay? Now, in all of those things, we have the understanding of intellect. So we can know stuff. But that's no different than what the Bible tells us. Listen to John 8:31 and 32. Then said Jesus to those Jews which believed on him, If ye continue in my word, then are ye my disciples indeed. Now notice this, and ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. This is the part of the heart that allows one to learn, to know, and to understand. This is the intellectual ability that we have. And so we understand very simply the very first part of the spiritual heart. It allows man to have this ability to think. Now here's the other problem though. Sometimes we as men, we'll think about things and yet we don't fully comprehend or understand it. The reason for that is simply we haven't gotten enough in our intellect to understand it. There are a number of things in this world that I think about that I simply can't grasp my hands around. And I'm not talking about spiritual things, although there are spiritual things I don't fully comprehend. But there are a number of things out in the world. I mean, I'll be advanced. I'm not a rocket scientist, for example. Okay, so if I were to sit down with a rocket scientist and he were to explain to me the mathematics behind what he does, most likely I wouldn't comprehend all of that. Okay, and it's because I haven't yet gained the intellect to be able to do that. But here's what I also know: with studying and learning and thinking, using my intellectual, my cognitive abilities, I could eventually get to where I understood and could carry on a conversation with, for example, a rocket engineer, right? I could get to that point. It would take a lot of work, but I could. So, listen to Ephesians 3:4. Whereby when you read, ye may understand my knowledge in the mystery of Christ. We understand intellect oftentimes comes through reading. When it comes to the Scriptures and understanding about the will of God, it always comes through reading. But with that being said, sometimes we learn through words. People will talk to us. A person who couldn't read could also learn about the Bible, but it would come through the words of others who are reading from the Bible. Does that make sense? And intellectually and logically, they can get it. They have to get it from the Word because faith, as we understand here, is an act of intellect. Our faith, our belief in a system of a faith that can save us and understanding what God wants us to do is based on intellect, not on an act of emotion. I have to say that because the religious world around us primarily wants to make faith about emotion. But there's a part of the spiritual heart we read about in the Bible that is focused on man's intellect. And again, Christianity is a religion of intellect. It is a learned religion. Paul said in Romans 10:10, for with the heart man believeth unto righteousness, and with the mouth confession is made unto salvation. So when he talks about with the heart man believes, again, we understand that he's talking about the Bible mind, and we know that because in our mind, that's where we believe, okay? That knowledge and that belief drives everything. I think so far most of you would say, okay, I understand exactly where we're going with the very first compartment of the spiritual heart. Now, unlike the atheist or the agnostic, we as Christians would say that we are Christians because, one, we've studied what the Bible has to say. We've studied the evidence, both historical and through the written word. And based on that, we have been persuaded through our intellect to become Christians. Okay? And again, you go to Romans 10:17. We know that faith cometh by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. That's the evidence that we're basing it on, much of it. Now, there are 3 different rules for the care of the intellect. It's very similar to the care of the actual physical heart. You go to the doctor and you're having heart problems. I'm thinking about Larry back here. There's some things they're going to tell you. First, you've got to have a proper diet. Okay? You've got to have proper exercise. You can't exercise too much, but you do also have to exercise. Larry, I see you looking at me back here. And third, there's got to be proper clothing. So let me break it down here real quick what I mean. First, there's proper diet. We know that there's proper diet for the physical heart. there's proper diet for the spiritual heart, and the proper diet for our spiritual heart is to have the truth. Listen to John 14:6. Jesus saith unto him, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh unto the Father but by me. Now, I'm going to talk here in a few minutes about how the spiritual heart can be deceived by a lack of truth. But the first thing, the proper diet, is truth. We then understand that there's a need for proper exercise. We know that with the physical heart. It's the same with the spiritual. The proper exercise I'm talking about is study and meditation on God's Word. Let me give you two verses. 1 Timothy 4:13. Till I come, give attendance to reading, to exhortation, to doctrine. 2 Timothy 2:15 says, Study to show thyself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. Now, we know that when we are physically out of shape, we have to begin to exercise on a regular basis to strengthen the body. Well, it's the exact same thing when you talk about the spiritual heart. It has to be a continuous, regular exercising that's taking place. Third, I talked about clothing. Well, the only way to clothe the intellect and protect it from the hazards of the outside elements, and I'm talking about like falsehood, people teaching error, things like that, that's by applying the truth to ourselves. So we have this first understanding. We talk about the intellect. The intellect is the digestive chamber of the spiritual heart. That's where everything comes in. It's where I begin to process it. It's where I begin to get understanding. And it's where I begin to gain this knowledge. Now let's talk about the emotion. The emotion is the combustion chamber of the spiritual heart. There are a number of verses, specifically Mark 12:30, where you see them making a distinction in there between the mind and also the emotion. Man is able to be overcome with or full of many different emotions. Let me give you just a couple. We can be full of love. We can be full of anger. We can be full of wrath, full of hatred, full of sadness. And there are a number of other emotions that one can be filled with. Now, as the word emotion suggests, this is the portion of the intellect or the intellectual heart that moves a man. And most of you have an understanding of what I'm talking about. First of all, we have intellect. We have understanding, and that then fuels the emotions. Let me look at it this way. How many of you have ever told a joke to somebody and they didn't laugh? And the reason they didn't laugh was they didn't actually understand what the joke actually meant. They didn't get it. I see a hand go raised. I've told jokes to people before, and they just sat there. Now, it could have been two things. One, either I'm not funny, or two, they didn't get the punchline. They didn't get the joke. Sometimes we don't have the intellect to allow us to understand what it is that someone's talking about. I'm one of the first ones who will admit I have been in that type of a conversation before. You take a person out of their element, for example, let me just make something up here. If I take a guy who works with horticulture, plants, let me break it down here. So a guy works with plants, that's all he works with, and I take him and I put him maybe in a business meeting. There's a very good chance he's not going to have any understanding of what they're talking about. Likewise, let's spin the table. I take a guy out of the office who's a businessman, and I take him to a greenhouse where you've got a bunch of men who are very proficient in horticulture. He's probably likewise not going to understand what they're talking about. Okay? Well, it's the same thing when we start to talk about emotions. There has to be something that drives our emotions. Oftentimes, that is seen through understanding. Now, I want you to listen here, because as we begin to get a little bit of an understanding about this, we know this: the information and experiences that we have, they drive man's physical senses, and then they're digested by the intellect, and that causes somebody to react in a certain way. How many of you have ever seen someone receive bad news, and virtually after a second of processing the news, they almost immediately either fall? You've probably seen examples where they've become weak to the stomach, or after they've let it process, they begin to cry. Okay, well, the very first part of the spiritual heart we talked about was the intellect. That's the grasping and the understanding. The second part, though, is to understand that grasping and understanding then drives man's emotions. Okay? These emotions, they cause us to flee. They cause us to fight. They cause us to cry. They cause us to be intrigued by someone. They cause us to love. All of that's caused by the thoughts of the mind. Okay? I want you to listen to Peter for a second. 1 Peter 1:13, he describes it this way. He says, "Wherefore, gird up the loins of your mind." I want you to think about that for just a second. It's an unusual phrase, probably not one that we use often. But he says, gird up the loins of your mind, be sober, and hope to the end for the grace that is to be brought unto you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. If he's telling us to gird up the loins of our mind, then what we understand here is he's indicating that the emotional reactions that we have, that the thought processes that we have, they can be controlled. And they are controlled based off the very first chamber we talked about, the chamber which allows me to comprehend, to understand. Now there's more that goes into it, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. But initially we need to understand that there is a chamber that understands, but there's one then that has emotions based off of that understanding. Okay? I began to think a little bit about this. Most of us drive. The same way that we would drive a car, and the same way that we would use the steering wheel to control where it is that we go, we have to understand that as Christians, we have to do the same thing with our knowledge, the same thing with our thoughts. We have to control our thoughts. We have to actually drive them to where it is that we want them to go. And when I say that, what I'm saying is there's maybe a number of things I would have to do to control how it is that I behave as a Christian. I'm going to control my eyes as a man, same as a female would. We're going to control our eyes. We're going to control what we look at. We're going to control what it is that we listen to, what it is that we hear. We're going to try to control what it is that we say. All of that based off of our intellect, okay? And one of the ways I do this, I would go back to Philippians 4:8 as we're talking about controlling emotions, because some of those are good things. Unfortunately, sometimes the emotions that come out are bad things. I'm talking about more of the lusts of the flesh. But the intellect allows the emotion to be driven. We want to think about what we, for example, see in Philippians 4:8. Finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good rapport, if there be any virtue and if there be any praise, think on these things. Now again, we get the understanding from Paul as he writes to the church there in Philippi that I have the ability to determine what I'm going to think about. And again, that's important because I understand that what I understand intellectually is going to drive my emotions, okay? And so if I don't grasp a control over things like my hands, my eyes, my thoughts, and the list would go on, I'll be a slave to those desires. Listen to James 1:14 through 15, and we'll go to the next chamber. James 1:14 and 15. But every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. And let me pause for a minute. We talked about intellect. We know each person has their own intellectual ability, right? We also understand that each person who has emotions, this emotional chamber, has their own areas that draw them away. And so he tells us that we're drawn away of our own lusts and enticed. And then he says, when lust hath conceived, it bringeth forth sin, and sin, when it is finished, bringeth forth death. So very simply, and I hope I'm doing an okay job here, we understand there's the first chamber of the spiritual heart. It understands stuff. We looked at a verse. We know that we can understand stuff. The Bible tells us that we can. We understand that there's an area of the spiritual heart which is based on either the lusts of the flesh or even the good desires, for example, that we would have. That's based, again, on knowledge. Now let's talk about the conscience. That's the judicial chamber of the moral heart. Let me try to explain what I mean here. Because each of these is dealing with really a mental aspect or understanding. There comes to the point where one's conscience is going to determine, or maybe you would say it sits in judgment over man's actions. And so that's the reason I'm going to describe it here as the judicial chamber of the heart. When you talk about the judicial system, we understand that it's the system overseen by a judge, right? Well, man has this same thing. Man's conscience judges his actions. Now, the problem with this is, for that process to be effective, we understand that man's judgment has to be in alignment with God's will, which we have recorded for us in God's Word. Most of us, I think, understand that in the world that's around us today, many people do have a conscience or a system that they judge themselves by. The problem is that's not the same system we judge ourselves by. And so we understand that the conscience, it commends and it condemns our past actions. Here's what I mean. If I did something in the past, and I'm going to use this with a calibrated conscience, calibrated to the Bible. If I've done something in the past and I understand what the Scriptures teach and I understand that they teach it's wrong, that condemns me. if I understand that my actions were okay, then I am commended, or I understand it was acceptable. And so the conscience deals with past issues. The conscience deals with present conduct. What I mean is I can know at the very moment that I'm participating in something whether that is acceptable or not acceptable based on the standard that I'm using. Now again, it's important we have a calibrated standard. So it deals with the things in the past. It deals with the things that are currently happening. It also deals with the things that I'm processing in my mind that I'm thinking about doing. And those could be good things and those could be bad things. But in all of those situations, the conscience either commends or condemns. Okay? Listen to Romans 2:15. We have an example here. Which show the works of the law written in their hearts. Notice this. The conscience also bearing witness, and their thoughts the mean, while accusing or else excusing one another. Now, here's what we get from this verse here. The conscience in this case here was based on the laws of God which were written on their heart. That's a correctly calibrated conscience. But let's remember, out in the world around us, for those who are not Christians, they may have a totally different system of morality that their conscience is based on. For example, I'm just going to throw some stuff out there. They may be okay with the use of alcohol and drugs. They may be okay with things such as abortion. They may be okay with things such as stealing, even if in their mind it was an acceptable reason to steal, let's say maybe to feed a family. I don't think you'd find many Christians who would say, even though I'm starving, I would go out and condone stealing. So I only bring that up to say that we need to understand that the conscience can be off. But with that being said, there is a part of the spiritual heart based on understanding which judges our actions, or it legislates our actions. Now, when I say the conscience is judicial and not legislative, here's what I mean. How many, well, probably none of you go to a court very often. If you had been found guilty of or accused of robbing a bank, I see Holly back here laughing. Maybe she has, I don't know. If somebody had been accused of robbing a bank, my guess would be, I've never been accused of robbing a bank, but my guess would be that they are very happy that when they get there, the judge doesn't make up the laws on the spot, right? See, because he's a judge, he's part of the judicial system, but he doesn't make laws, he only enforces the laws. It's the same thing with our conscience. Our conscience doesn't make up the laws. It's simply carrying out an understanding based on some type of a system it already has, whether it's an incorrect system or a correct system, okay? So we have an understanding that the judge doesn't make laws, he just enforces those laws that he's been taught are right or wrong. The same with the conscience. Conscience can be calibrated correctly or incorrectly. The conscience is very good at judging. Here's the problem. It's, again, only as dependable as the standard by which it is using. And that's why we have a difference in belief about what is okay and what is not okay. And with that being said, let's say this. The conscience is very susceptible to being in error. It's very susceptible to being incorrect. Now, an uneducated and a misinformed conscience is going to indulge in actions that are wrong. Oftentimes, the best example is a biblical one. So let's look at one who did this. You probably know exactly where I'm going. He began to participate in things that he thought were okay, but later he found out that his conscience was off kilter. And I'm talking certainly about Paul. Listen to Acts 26, 9 through 11. I verily thought within myself that I ought to do many things contrary to the name of Jesus of Nazareth. Let me pause for a minute. What Paul's saying there was, I thought these were all okay. And he did at the time. Notice verse 10, which thing I also did in Jerusalem, and many of the saints did I shut up in prison, having received authority from the chief priests, and when they were put to death, I gave my voice against them. So he'd been given a standard it was okay to persecute these Christians. As a matter of fact, he was fine with it. Okay, he gave his consent. And he goes on and says, and I punished them oft in every synagogue, and compelled them to blaspheme. And being exceedingly mad against them, I persecuted them even unto strange cities. Now, we don't need to go back and look any further, but here's an example of somebody whose conscience was telling them something was okay, who later found out that the very thing they were involved in was not okay. Now, with that being said, it is very possible for both the trained, and I mean the one who is righteous, and the untrained, the one who is unrighteous, conscience to become callous. Let me start with the easier one to grasp. First of all, we know there are many people out in the world who are very calloused individuals. There's not a lot of maybe that would even, well, I'm thinking about the environment I grew up in, and I know where Larry works and a number of other people. In a manufacturing setting, you work around some people who are very calloused people. There's not a lot of things that you could say that would shock them or would really even offend them. But I want you to understand there are also those who are Christians who have become calloused. They become calloused for a number of reasons, and so we need to understand that the conscience can become extremely calloused. Listen to Ephesians 4:19. Who being past feeling have given themselves over unto lasciviousness to work all uncleanness with greediness. Now, it's interesting they were past feeling. You guys know what a callus is. Here's the idea. They couldn't feel anymore, and that's what happens when you get a callus. I actually have one right here on my hand. Their hearts have become calloused, often like people's hands have gotten very hard. My hands have gotten softer over the years. I used to have very hard hands. I noticed that they've become softer. That opposite happens sometimes with the heart. Sometimes the heart is very soft, very receptive, and the opposite happens is it becomes very calloused. So here's what we understand. First, there's a part of the spiritual heart that allows one to understand. It allows one to gain knowledge. It allows one to grasp, and we would call that the intellect. There is then the area of the spiritual heart which is based on emotion. That's where somebody understands something and then they react to it. There may be feelings of love, hatred, whatever. We've all seen that happen. There's then this third area. The third area is really the area of the conscience, or we called it the judicial chamber. Okay? It allows one to judge actions. Then there's this fourth area. This fourth area, we're going to call it the will. The will is the executive chamber of the spiritual heart. So man is endowed with the power of choice, and the will is the seat of that faculty. Here's what I mean. Let me give an example. So I have the ability, for example, when I get up on Sunday morning, that I can go, let me explain it in a very easy way. I can go to church or I cannot go to church. That's my option. Now, based on the very first chamber, the chamber of intellect, I know that in Acts 20, verse 7, they worshiped every Sunday, every first day of the week. I also know in 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2, that they were giving on the first day of the week. So here's what I know intellectually, according to the Bible. I have requirements of me as a Christian. Okay? Now, I may be angry at somebody because of something that happened at the church building. And so I allow my emotion to come out, and let's say that I'm now upset. There's the first two chambers. Then I understand that maybe that's based on conscience. Maybe I realize that I'm not going to service on Sunday morning. My conscience tells me that I should go. But I have the option here according to my will. This is the fourth chamber. I'm going to base what I'm going to do on all of those previous things. Am I too angry to allow myself to go even though I have an understanding that I should? Am I going to allow my emotions to push on that? And am I going to allow my conscience maybe to let me go? Well, all of those, again, are governed by the will. Let me try to make it a little bit different. So you would have those who have a decision. Let's use the one I used earlier. Those who have the option of stealing or not stealing. Let's say they've not eaten for a while. Well, again, he has to make a decision. This is where will comes in. The other chambers of the moral heart, they're all subject to the will. He can determine to base his actions on his understanding, on his emotions, or even on his conscience, but ultimately it comes down to the fact that he has to make a choice. So listen to Ephesians 2:3. Among whom also we all had our conversation, that's manner of life, in times past, notice this, in the lusts of our flesh. Well, how did they do that? Fulfilling the desires of the flesh and of the mind, and were by nature, let me pause for a minute because many will teach inherited sin out of this verse. When you see that and were by nature, that means and by long-standing practice. It does not mean that they were born or it was in their nature to do bad things. That word means by long-standing practice. They were, by long-standing practice, the children of wrath, even as others. Well, here's what I learned very quickly from Ephesians 2:3 and from the fact that Ephesians became Christians. Oftentimes, we based what it is that we did or would do, on our intellect, on our conscience, and on our emotional feelings. And yet we have this understanding that through my own free will, my own choice, I could actually choose to do something else. And we actually see that taking place here with the Ephesians. And so while the will is affected by the intellect, it has to restrain the emotion. There are a number of times when I want to do something that I know that I should not do. And intellectually I may know it, but I have to get my will in check to make sure that I don't do it. Let me try to phrase it like this way. The emotions that we have, they tug at the will. They try to make me do something, kind of like a horse at the reins. How many of you guys have ever ridden a horse? You ever had a horse where even though you wanted to go left, he went right? Or you wanted to go right and he went left? That's sometimes kind of like our will. We know that we should go left, but we desire to go right. Or we know that we should go right, but we desire to go left, okay? The will is in the saddle, and he steers the emotions and the desires. But here's the thing, ultimately it comes down to man's free will and choice based on all the other things that we've looked at. You guys ever heard someone say, hold your horses? Usually that's talking about a very impatient person, right? If you think about what I just said, the fact that the will is the one trying to drive, kind of like he's in the saddle, that's oftentimes why we would use a phrase like that, hold your horses. It's a person who's not using their intellect, they're just using their will only. And so our conscience, it lobbies our free will to try to get it to act in accordance with whatever it sees as okay. Again, here's the problem. Sometimes what we think's okay isn't really okay. But as we begin to break this down, and I'm going to stop. I don't think I can do it much of a better job. Let me break it back down again. And I know that logically it makes sense. We know that our Bible heart, our mind, has an area that allows us to digest information. It is the intellectual hub. It's where I learn stuff, and it's where I can comprehend and understand. I know that my comprehension and my understanding drives my emotions. If I understand that I physically love somebody, that drives the emotion there of love, right? And so we have an understanding that intellect drives our emotions. We also have an understanding that each of us has a conscience. The conscience is based on our intellect. Sometimes it's a correct standard, sometimes it's an incorrect standard. But then there's the fourth area of the spiritual heart, that is the will. I don't have the verse here right in front of me, but we talked about will worship. Matter of fact, Paul was addressing them that they were worshiping a God that they did not know. There is inappropriate worship. There's all kinds of things when you begin to talk about the will pushing the desires of man, right? Well, it's the same thing here as we talk about the executive chamber of the spiritual heart. There is a will. That will is based off of knowledge, emotion, and conscience. Sometimes we fall in line with will, sometimes we don't. So as I try to draw this to a close here, hopefully that gives us a little bit of an understanding. I know that the way that I was taught about the spiritual heart was very simply this. I think they just said the spiritual heart is the Bible mind. That's all the information I got on it. And what they said was true, but it doesn't entail all of the things involved in the Bible heart. So as I draw this to a close, my first concern is that each of us has a heart that is understanding of the Scriptures and has been added to the church. Maybe there's someone here watching this tonight or even here who's never been taught about that. Well, it's not a complicated process. In all of the conversion accounts, you had somebody teaching the gospel. Romans 10:17. Faith comes by hearing. They believed what they had been taught about Jesus Christ. I think all of us would say that we're Christians because we believe that Jesus Christ was the Messiah. And Jesus made it very clear that if you don't believe, you're going to die in your sins, John 8:24. We have examples of those who, when they understood this and understood sin, they repented of their sins, Luke 13:3. We also have example of them confessing the name of Christ, just as Jesus commanded, Matthew 10:32 and 33. And in every conversion account, we have them being immersed for the remission of their sins, just again as Jesus commanded, Mark 16:16. So as I draw this to a close, if you're here and you're not a Christian, you can become a Christian tonight. Maybe you're here and there's something you're struggling with. We could be more than happy to pray for you. Or if there's a way that we can help you in another way spiritually, you can simply come forward as we stand and we sing a song of invitation.